They walked hand in hand into Winterfell's great hall. Outside, the last of the royal procession had vanished into the swirling dust on the King's Road, taking with it the clamor of gilded armor, Cersei's half-veiled glances, and Robert Baratheon's boisterous shouts. The courtyard felt oddly calm now, as though the castle itself exhaled in relief. Winterfell's gates were closed once more, and the bustle that had marked Robert's stay eased into something closer to the measured pace of northern life. Yet the hush brought an awareness of what they all faced next. The marriage between Jon Snow and Margaery Tyrell was sealed, and King Robert, wounded but recovering, had returned south. The realm's tensions might simmer anew, beyond the Stark walls. And within Winterfell's own heart, there would be fresh challenges. For it was no small thing to bring the Rose of Highgarden into the domain of the direwolf. Jon and Margaery reached the relative quiet of a side corridor. The stone walls loomed tall and ancient, lit by the warm glow of torches. Motes of dust drifted in the light. Jon led her toward the solar, where Ned Stark and the rest of the household would soon gather to discuss matters that had been set aside during the king's convalescence. Margaery's hand was warm in his own, and a faint smile curved her lips. Despite everything, the worry over Robert's health, the Lannisters' watchful presence, the pressures of her new position, she carried herself with a steady grace. They parted at the solar's door, where Margaery excused herself to speak with the stewards about the day's needs. Jon stepped in to find his father and Robb bent over a map spread across a large table. The room smelled faintly of parchment and candle wax. The floor was scattered with missives from across the north, urgent or otherwise, neglected in the swirl of royal events. Outside the tall windows, the overcast sky hung low, promising more cold to come. Ned straightened. "Jon," he said by way of greeting, beckoning him closer. "We were just discussing the state of the eastern roads. Lord Serwyn's last letter suggests heavy rains south of the Dreadfort. They fear the roads are nearly impassable for caravans." Jon took a place by the table's edge, glancing at the older documents. He saw a mention of the Carhold, shipping out furs, a note on shipments from White Harbor, and a scrawled letter from an innkeep near Moat Cailin complaining about bandits. Here were the small but constant burdens of the north: logistics, roads, harvest yields, fortifications. He inhaled quietly, aware that these might one day be among his duties, especially if he and Margaery took on a role overseeing a region or traveling south to handle negotiations with the Reach. Robb tapped a spot on the map. "I told Father we might send a small crew of laborers to clear the drainage paths, but we don't have enough men to spare if we want to keep the roads near Deepwood Motte in good condition as well." Ned folded his arms. "We'll have to prioritize. If trade caravans are blocked near the Dreadfort, we'll see fewer goods making it here for the rest of spring. With the king's visit behind us, we still need to replenish certain stores. The last thing we want is a shortage, especially if the next winter proves harsh." Jon studied the map. He had traveled some of these roads with Margaery to the minor holdfasts, but many more were merely names he'd heard in the Great Hall's routine. "My lord," Jon ventured, "maybe we can coordinate with House Tyrell soon. Margaery's father might be open to sending some coin north, or laborers who are skilled in building. They have resources that might help." Ned's gaze flicked to him, thoughtful. "You believe they would send workers all this way?" "Perhaps not in large numbers," Jon conceded. "But Margaery has spoken of her father's interest in seeing the North become a reliable partner in trade. If roads block our goods, that hurts the alliance. It's worth discussing." Robb nodded, mulling it over. "Coin from the Tyrells, perhaps, if not men. But we must be careful not to appear dependent, or they'll think the North weaker than it is." Ned rubbed his jaw. "Alliances walk a fine line between cooperation and reliance. Still, Jon is right that a certain measure of aid could strengthen both sides. Let us consider drafting a letter to Lord Mace. Polite, direct, and open to negotiation." They went on discussing the details: which roads needed the most urgent repair, what workforce might be spared without weakening critical defenses, how best to frame the request so it felt like an exchange of mutual benefit. Jon took mental notes, determined to learn. This was the daily slog of governance. lacking the glory of the battlefield or the romance of a king's feast. Yet, he realized it was the backbone of any stable realm. Wars might be won with swords, but prosperity was won with quills and diligence. At last, Ned motioned for the documents to be collected. "We'll finalize the letter tomorrow," he said. "For now, get some rest. There will always be more tasks awaiting us." Jon and Robb moved to follow, but Ned caught Jon's arm gently. "A moment, if you please." Robb gave a curious glance but left the solar. Ned waited until the door shut. Candlelight gilded his features, highlighting the silver in his hair that had grown more pronounced in recent years. His face was kind but lined with care. "Jon," he said softly, "I want you to know that I'm proud of how you and Margaery have handled things. The king's wound, the Lannisters. It was a great deal of pressure for newlyweds to endure." Jon lowered his eyes, a spark of both gratitude and humility flickering within him. "Thank you, Father. I only hope I can continue to serve our house." Ned's hands came to rest gently on Jon's shoulders, a rare gesture of open affection. "You do. You will. And in time, this alliance might give you a place of your own. Perhaps a keep nearer the south, or some arrangement that allows the Tyrells to expand their influence while keeping you and Margaery close to the Starks. We must be prepared for all possibilities." Jon's heart thrummed. A keep of his own. That was something that had never seemed more than a daydream. He recalled the old plan to join the Night's Watch, how that path had once seemed his only honorable future. Now everything had changed. He nodded, though he felt the weight of the unknown. Ned gave him a final, measured look and then released him. "Go on. Margaery's likely waiting. Enjoy the rest of your day." Jon thanked him and stepped out. Down the corridor, he caught sight of Margaery speaking with one of her ladies-in-waiting, Gwyneth, a soft-spoken young woman from the Reach who had acclimated poorly to the North's cold. Margaery had a gentle hand on Gwyneth's arm, offering some reassurance. When she saw Jon approach, she excused herself and turned, cloak swirling lightly around her ankles. "My husband," she said, letting the word rest on her tongue with a tiny smile. Even weeks into their marriage, it still felt new to say. Jon warmed at the greeting, though he glanced around out of old habit to ensure no one stared too intently. The bastard of Winterfell, he thought, now walking the halls as a wedded man. It never stopped surprising him. "You were speaking with Gwyneth?" Margaery nodded. "She's worried about returning to Highgarden. Her father is ill. She wants to go back, but I told her it might be best to wait until we're certain the roads are safe. I've offered to send a raven to her family." Jon's expression grew thoughtful. "That might be wise. I've just come from Father's discussion about the roads. Travel is uncertain, especially near the Dreadfort. We can't risk sending someone alone." She sighed. "I feel for her, though. She longs for the warmth of home, both the weather and her own household." Jon tucked his arm around Margaery's, leading her down the corridor. "Highgarden's warmth is a far cry from Winterfell's walls of stone and ice. Not everyone adapts as well as you have." She gave him a sidelong smile, letting her head rest against his shoulder for a brief moment. "I've tried. Even if I can't say I love the cold, I do love what I found here. The sense of resilience, the unity in adversity." Her voice grew softer. "And you?" Jon's cheeks tinged red, but he guided them onward. It still felt strangely bold to be so open about affection. He coughed lightly. "Perhaps we can do something to help Gwyneth. A small escort if the road's clear. Or we see if House Serwyn can host her en route." "That's an idea," Margaery agreed. "We'll talk to your father and see if the Tyrell household could spare a guard or two, if any remain behind." They paused near a narrow window, the sky visible through rippling glass. Snow flurries drifted in the courtyard below. Margaery watched them in silence a moment, then turned to Jon. "Do you ever regret this arrangement?" she asked softly, surprising him. "Regret?" He shook his head, startled by the question. "Why would I?" She searched his face. "I know it was not your choice initially. It was arranged for you by your father, by my father, all for political ends. We've made it work, but I sometimes wonder if you feel you lost your freedom, your chance to choose your own path." Jon considered it, recalling how he had once longed to join the Night's Watch. "Before you came, I only saw one path. At least that path was my choice, or so I thought. But meeting you, marrying you, it gave me a life I never imagined. A place of respect I never expected to find." "No," he said firmly, taking her hand. "I don't regret it." She pressed her lips together, relieved. "Good, because I found I care for this life more than I expected as well. I wouldn't trade it away, even if it means letting go of some illusions." He bent to kiss her knuckles, a soft and fleeting gesture. Just then, they heard footsteps. They broke apart, turning to see Sansa approaching, her face bright. She gave a small curtsy. "Jon? Margaery? Mother wanted me to ask if you'll be joining us for the midday meal. She said we're all to gather in the hall." "We will," Margaery said, smiling at Sansa. "Thank you." Sansa beamed and hurried off, clearly relishing the small duties that let her feel involved. Jon and Margaery followed at a more measured pace, reflecting on the swirl of responsibilities and small joys that now marked their days. Life at Winterfell found its equilibrium in the following weeks. The initial rush of the wedding and the royal visit gave way to daily tasks. Overseeing the castle, planning trade routes, writing letters to southern lords. The snows still clung to the north, but the promise of a mild spring teased them with occasional rays of sunshine. Margaery adapted to wearing heavier cloaks and thicker boots, but she never lost her fascination for the stark beauty of the northern landscape. Jon continued to train in the yard, sometimes with Robb, other times with the guard. He caught glimpses of Margaery watching from the gallery, and whenever their eyes met, a reassuring warmth passed between them. One morning, just as the bells tolled for breakfast, a raven arrived from Highgarden. It bore the seal of House Tyrell. Margaery took it to her chambers to read privately, then emerged wearing a thoughtful expression. Jon met her gaze. "What does it say?" She unfolded the parchment. "It's from my father. He congratulates us again on the wedding. Hopes King Robert's injury didn't disrupt too much. But there's also..." She trailed off, scanning down the page. "He asks if we can come to Highgarden for a visit. He suggests it would be good for us to show the realm that our union is recognized not just in the north, but in the Reach as well." Jon frowned slightly. "Travel all the way to Highgarden? That's quite a journey." Margaery nodded. "It is. And I suspect my father wants to display us to his bannermen, to reassure them that this alliance truly exists. Possibly also to glean whether you and I are firmly aligned with his interests." Jon saw the complication. They were Starks in the north, but Margaery's father might want to ensure they didn't forget the Tyrell perspective. "What do you think?" She folded the letter carefully. "It might be wise. If we're going to make this alliance work, we can't just stay in Winterfell forever. The Lords of the Reach are curious about me, about you, about what all of this means. But we'll need your father's leave, and it could be complicated." Jon exhaled. "We should talk to father. If we do go, we must ensure it won't look like we're deserting the north, or that we're ignoring the tasks we have here." They brought the matter to Ned later that day, in the privacy of his solar. Ned listened quietly as Margaery explained the gist of Mace Tyrell's letter. At length, Ned nodded. "It was inevitable that House Tyrell would want you both to visit. Showing their new son bylaw to the southern courts will be a statement, and it might ease some tensions. I don't disapprove if it's managed properly. The journey is long, but we can spare a suitable escort." Jon hesitated. "But do we want to leave Winterfell with matters unsettled? We still have concerns about bandits, about the roads near the Dreadfort." Ned gave him a faint, understanding smile. "Those matters are ongoing. Robb and I can handle them. As for you, Jon, you have a new role now. Part of that role is representing the North in the South. No one else can do that for you save your wife." Jon cast a glance at Margaery, who offered a small, resolute nod. "Very well, we'll prepare, though I'd want to ensure the roads are passable." "A few more weeks of mild weather might help," Ned said. "We can aim to depart after the worst of the snow melt, perhaps in early spring." They agreed. A reply was drafted, politely accepting Mace Tyrell's invitation and stating that Jon Snow and Margaery Tyrell would make the journey once conditions allowed. The Raven took flight the next morning. Margaery's gaze followed it from the courtyard, a swirl of curiosity and anticipation in her expression. Jon wondered what Mace Tyrell truly wanted. Was it pure courtesy, or were deeper intrigues at play? Word spread slowly around the castle. Jon Snow and Lady Margaery would head south soon, possibly accompanied by a small retinue of Stark men and some of Margaery's ladies. Reactions ranged from excitement among the household. Some of the younger servants had never traveled so far, to quiet apprehension from the older folk, who distrusted the southern roads. Theon Greyjoy teased Jon about entering a land of soft songs and sweet wines, while Robb tried to mask his own envy. "Send me a letter describing the feasts," Robb joked, "and maybe how the knights fight. I might learn something new." Jon and Margaery prepared in what ways they could. Margaery directed her ladies to gather suitable garments for warmer weather, though she advised them to keep a few heavier cloaks for the journey over the neck, where the climate could still be chilly and damp. Jon oversaw the gathering of supplies for a modest escort, a handful of guards, enough to ensure safety without seeming a challenge to the Tyrells. Ghost would go as well, of course. Jon would not leave the direwolf behind. Arya seemed particularly intrigued by the notion of traveling so far. She cornered Margaery one afternoon in the courtyard. "You'll see the Mander, right?" Arya asked, eyes bright with curiosity. "And Highgarden's towers, and maybe the seat of the Tarleys?" Margaery laughed gently at Arya's barrage of questions. "Yes, we'll likely see the Mander, and I'm sure we'll pass near Horn Hill. Perhaps we can even greet Lord Tarley if Father arranges it." She leaned in conspiratorially. "I'll bring back stories for you." Arya grinned. "Someday I want to travel like that. I want to see the world outside Winterfell. No offense to my home, but there's more out there." "Yes, there is," Margaery agreed, though she cast a glance at Jon's half-sister with a touch of concern. Arya's restless spirit was well known. "For now, though, you must be patient. The realm can be dangerous." Arya nodded, her expression sobering. "I know, but I can handle danger." Margaery, thinking of the men who would not hesitate to harm a Stark girl on the road if it suited some plot, felt a pang of protectiveness. "Then learn all you can, and perhaps one day the time will be right." Arya gave a firm nod and bounded off, leaving Margaery with a mixture of fondness and worry for the girl's future. But she admired Arya's boldness too. It reminded her that not all ladies had to be docile. The North had a quiet strength, and sometimes that manifested even in its youngest daughters. The snows melted in a steady thaw, leaving the courtyard a mix of slush and mud. Servants mopped the floors constantly, vainly trying to keep the corridors from turning into slick hazards. Outside Winterfell's walls, the winter-brown fields gave way to patches of new grass, and the wolves would drip with meltwater. Ravens from various corners of the north brought news of the break in the weather, along with the usual petty squabbles. A stolen horse at a village near Long Lake, a dispute over a boundary stone near the rills, a drunken fight among small folk at a roadside inn. With each passing day, the roads grew more passable. Finally, the day came to depart. A crisp morning greeted them, the sky a pale blue streaked with wisps of cloud. The wind carried a hint of spring, though a chill lingered in the shade. Jon, clad in practical riding leathers beneath a cloak of sturdy gray, stood in the courtyard with Ghost at his side, surveying the retinue. Margaery wore traveling attire of dark green wool, simpler than her usual gowns, with a short train she could tuck up when riding. Her cloak was lined with fur, a testament that winter's breath might still linger. Behind them, a small cluster of Stark guards prepared horses, loading saddlebags with provisions. Two of Margaery's ladies were present, Gwyneth and an older companion named Eleanor, who had served the Tyrells for decades. Eleanor was a steady sort, unflappable even in the North's climate. Ned and Catelyn stood by to bid them farewell. Robb, Theon, Sansa, and Arya were there too, along with a scattering of other onlookers. Bran and Rickon craned their necks from a distance, calling their goodbyes. Margaery stepped forward to embrace Sansa, who looked torn between excitement and sorrow at their departure. Arya hung back a moment, trying to look indifferent, but ended up exchanging a quick hug with Margaery before scurrying away. Jon clasped Robb's arm, meeting his brother's gaze. "Look after Winterfell," Jon murmured, "and train hard. I might need you if I get in trouble down south." Robb laughed. "I'll come running if you do. Just watch yourself with all those knights and lords. And remember, you're a Stark, no matter what name they give you." Jon nodded, a lump forming in his throat. "I will." Ned approached, placing a hand on Jon's shoulder, then turning to Margaery with a respectful inclination of his head. "Safe travels. Let Lord Mace Tyrell know we remain grateful for his hospitality and open to future collaboration. And be mindful of your surroundings. The roads can be perilous, especially near the Riverlands, with the tensions that never fully die there." Margaery thanked him, while Catelyn offered a quieter farewell. Her expression remained that polite mask, but she squeezed Margaery's hand once in genuine parting. At last, they mounted their horses. Jon swung into the saddle, Ghost pacing beside him, ears alert. Margaery sat astride her mare with a practiced ease, though she adjusted her cloak against the wind. Then, with a final wave, the small procession clattered out of Winterfell's gate, heading south along the King's Road. The journey began under gentle sunshine, a relief after the recent cold. Still, pockets of snow remained along the roadside, and the nights brought sharp frosts. The group kept a moderate pace, pausing each evening at inns or minor holdfasts that recognized the Stark banners. Margaery, familiar with the custom of courtesy, presented small tokens or gold to the hosts who received them, ensuring goodwill. Jon noticed how deftly she navigated these interactions, always choosing a kind word for the local families. Even among the modest taverns of the north, she never acted above them. It won her quiet admiration. Once they passed Moat Cailin, a fortress that loomed over the neck with its half-ruined towers, the climate began to change. The damp swamps of the neck tested their patience with biting insects and treacherous ground. Twice they had to dismount and lead the horses through boggy patches. Ghost prowled ahead, at times returning with brackish mud on his paws. But eventually, they cleared the neck and emerged into the flatter lands of the Riverlands, a place of wide fields and meandering streams that carried faint echoes of old battles from the time of the Targaryen Wars. They took rest at a larger inn near the crossroads. The inn sign showed a weathered stag, though the writing beneath was nearly illegible. Word traveled fast that a young couple from the north, bearing the Stark sigil and a golden rose pinned to the lady's cloak, had arrived. Local villagers peered in curiosity. Gossip circulated about who these travelers might be. Some recognized the Tyrell rose, and whispers abounded of the wedding that had made the bastard of Ned Stark into a southern lord, at least in rumor. Jon tried not to bristle at hearing himself called a bastard in hushed voices. He reminded himself that the realm would always see him that way, no matter how many alliances were forged. Margaery, noticing his unease, quietly took his arm in the common room one evening. "They'll always find something to whisper about," she said gently. "Let it pass. We have more important matters ahead." He nodded, subdued. "I know. Still, it bothers me more now, somehow. Before, it was just me. But now I worry about how it reflects on you." Margaery smiled softly, though her eyes were serious. "Don't. I chose this. Let them whisper what they will. We'll show them what we can accomplish." Her words steadied him more than she knew. He found himself drawing on her calm as they rode on, crossing into the wilder expanse of the Reach's northern borders. The land grew greener, dotted with flowering shrubs and farmland. Even in early spring, the difference from the north was stark: warmer air, gentler breezes, the sweet scent of blossoms carried by the wind. Gwyneth, Margaery's young lady-in-waiting, nearly wept with relief to see the soft hills of home again. Their escort remained watchful, though. The roads near the borders of the Reach could harbor brigands, and alliances with the Crown did not guarantee safety. Once, they heard rumors that a band of outlaws had attacked a caravan on a side path, but after sending a pair of scouts, they found no sign of immediate threat. Nonetheless, Margaery insisted on vigilance. I refuse to be an easy target, she said quietly. At last, one afternoon, they crested a gentle slope and beheld the Mander winding through a broad valley. Beyond it, rising from a lush tapestry of gardens and fields, stood Highgarden. Even at a distance, the castle was splendid. Tall white stone walls overlooking terraced gardens that spilled down toward the river. From each turret flew the golden rose. The sun caught windows of stained glass, sparkling like gems in the afternoon light. Margaery breathed a quiet sigh of emotion. "Home," she murmured, her voice carrying relief and a pang of nostalgia. Jon observed it all with wonder. He had heard countless tales of the grandeur of Highgarden, how its gardens were unrivaled in beauty, how even the air seemed perfumed by flowers. Seeing it now, he felt the weight of those stories. There was a lightness to the land that contrasted so sharply with the North's rugged austerity. They followed the road toward the main gates, passing farmland where peasants paused in their labors to stare at the arriving riders. The fields bloomed with early spring buds, pale pink blossoms, rows of vegetables, grapevines just beginning to sprout. Rows of apple and peach trees lined the approach, though not yet in full bloom. Margaery's face lit with recognition, pointing out certain orchard groves and meadows to Jon. He listened intently, smiling at her excitement. At Highgarden's walls, guards wearing the rose sigil called out in greeting. Seeing Margaery Tyrell approaching, they sprang to open the gates, and the travelers passed through into a wide courtyard paved with pale stone. Instantly, servants hurried forward, stable boys rushing to take the horses. Margaery dismounted gracefully. Jon followed suit, feeling a swirl of emotions as his boots touched the courtyard's warm stones. A herald in Tyrell livery stepped forth, bowing low to Margaery. "My lady, we've awaited your return. Welcome home." His gaze flicked to Jon, uncertain, but Margaery gestured with composure. "This is Jon Snow, my husband," she said, voice resonant with authority. "Please inform my father that we have arrived." The herald snapped upright, murmuring acknowledgement, and rushed off into the castle. Margaery's ladies, Gwyneth and Eleanor, tried to hide smiles. Jon overheard one stable boy whisper to another, "The Northern Lord. They said he was a bastard." Another stable boy shushed him. Jon's jaw tensed, but he forced himself to remain calm. Already, the difference between the open acceptance of the North and the sometimes more subtle judgments of the South felt tangible. Margaery touched his arm lightly. "Come," she whispered. "Father will see us in the main hall. Let's be gracious." He nodded, exhaling. They crossed the courtyard. Jon noticed everything. The marble statues of knights and ladies in nooks along the walls, the stands of rare flowers curated in decorative planters, the bright livery of guards. Even the breeze smelled sweeter here, tinged with 1,000 blooms. Felt like a different world. Inside, they were met by a swirl of motion. Servants bearing trays of lemon water, pages scurrying to fetch Margaery's baggage, and a few southern knights wearing Tyrell colors. At the hall's entrance, Margaery's father stood in full finery. Lord Mace Tyrell, portly and ruddy-cheeked, wearing a robe of green and gold. By his side stood Margaery's grandmother, the Lady Olenna Tyrell, diminutive in stature but formidable in presence. A subtle hush fell as Margaery and Jon stepped forward. "Margaery, my dear child," Mace Tyrell exclaimed, hurrying forward with arms outstretched. He enveloped her in an effusive embrace, then turned to Jon with a wide smile that did not entirely reach his eyes. "And welcome, welcome, Lord Snow, yes? Or shall we say Stark Snow now? He gave a booming laugh that sounded just a shade forced. "We're so delighted you've come." Jon felt his cheeks warm. The question of his name was always precarious, but he inclined his head politely. "Thank you for receiving us, Lord Tyrell. It was a long journey, but we are glad to be here." Mace clapped Jon's shoulder, a gesture that wobbled Jon slightly. Yes, we shall see you well-fed, well-rested, and introduced to the wonders of Highgarden. Come, I've had quarters prepared for you, and tomorrow we shall hold a feast in your honor." Let all of the Reach see the union that binds us to Winterfell." Margaery offered a courteous nod, her posture poised. "We're grateful, Father. How is Loras?" "I expected him to greet us." Mace waved a hand. "Off on a hunt or practicing the joust or some nonsense. That boy never can sit still. He'll be back by evening, I'm sure." As Mace spoke, Lady Olenna Tyrell stepped forward, cane tapping lightly on the floor. She was dressed in a high-collared gown of turquoise, her face framed by a matching headdress. She peered at Margaery with sharp, hawkish eyes, then transferred that keen gaze to Jon. "So," Olenna said in a clipped tone, "this is the North's answer to forging alliances, is it? Handsome enough if a bit pale. A bastard, but it's all the rage these days from what I hear. Welcome to Highgarden, Jon Snow." Jon inclined his head, uncertain how to respond to such directness. Olenna Tyrell's reputation for bluntness preceded her. "Thank you, my lady," he managed, trying not to show discomfort. Olenna sniffed. Well, we've always had an appreciation for strong stock in the Tyrell line. The North is rumored to breed hardy people. Let's see how you fare in the South's heat, shall we?" Margaery gently slid her arm through Jon's, a subtle show of solidarity. "Grandmother," she said in mild admonishment, though her tone remained respectful, "we are tired from the journey. If you'll excuse us, we'd like to settle in." Of course," Olenna replied, her expression unreadable. "Go rest, but come see me in my solar tomorrow. I'm curious about your doings in the North. There are so many rumors swirling." With that, Mace Tyrell beckoned a steward to lead them to their quarters. As Jon and Margaery followed, they exchanged a brief, wry smile. Highgarden was every inch the grand seat of the Reach, from the polished floors to the tapestries depicting heroic knights and fabled gardens. But beneath that beauty lurked the subtle tensions of a powerful, politically minded family. Jon realized with a sinking feeling that these next days would be yet another trial of courtesy and composure. Their assigned chambers overlooked a sweeping garden terrace. The windows stood open to admit warm breezes, carrying the fragrance of roses and lavender. The room itself was lavish by Jon's standards, with a large bed draped in silk, plush chairs arranged around a low table, and intricately woven rugs. A side door opened onto a small balcony with climbing vines. Margaery smiled wistfully as she took in the familiar scents. "This was my mother's solar once," she said softly. "I remember her braiding my hair by that window when I was a child." Jon glanced around, sensing the weight of memories. He thought of how different his own childhood had been: winter-chapped cheeks, a simpler bedchamber in the ancient corridors of Winterfell, the occasional kindly words from Ned or Robb, but always overshadowed by his bastardy. Here, Margaery had grown up with every comfort, yet she'd lost her mother at a young age. They both carried scars of a sort. He laid a hand on her shoulder. "It suits you," he said quietly. "Warm, welcoming, filled with flowers. Like you." She laughed softly, turning to draw him into a gentle embrace. "You're too kind. I only hope you won't feel ill at ease in such luxury." "I'm not used to it, but I'll manage," Jon replied, glancing at the thick tapestries. They depicted scenes of knights besting mythical beasts, of golden roses entwined with banners. "I might miss the simpler stone of Winterfell after a while." Margaery's eyes softened. "And I might miss the hush of the godswood. But let's see how we fare. I'll show you my favorite corners of Highgarden. Places less gilded, more real. If they still exist after all these years of renovations." Jon nodded. Before either could say more, a pair of servants entered discreetly, carrying ewers of warm water and fresh linens, ready to assist them with bathing or changing clothes. Margaery signaled her thanks, and the servants moved about the chamber, setting everything in place. Jon watched them with a flicker of unease. He was used to Winterfell's staff, who respected personal space, whereas these southern servants seemed more forward in offering to help him remove his boots or unbuckle the dusty straps of his cloak. He politely waved them off, preferring to do it himself. A short while later, dressed in fresh tunics, they were summoned to a light supper with Margaery's father and grandmother to welcome them properly. This supper, held in a small dining room, was far less formal than a feast in the great hall but still sumptuous by Jon's standards. The table groaned with roasted duck, fresh greens drizzled with honey, crusty bread, and carafes of wine from the arbor. Mace Tyrell, in his element, expounded on the wonders of his domain, boasting about the yield of the vineyards and the skill of his knights. Olenna sipped her wine, offering barbed commentary now and then. Midway through the meal, Ser Loras Tyrell strode in, clad in a simple tunic unadorned by armor, his hair slightly disheveled as though from recent training. At the sight of Margaery, he broke into a bright smile. "Sister," he said, crossing the room to kiss her cheek. Then he turned to Jon. "Brother," he added, the word spoken lightly but not without warmth. "I'm glad to see you again." Jon rose, clasping Loras's offered hand. "It's good to see you, Ser Loras. I hope your training went well." Loras nodded. "Always, and I apologize for missing your arrival. Father neglected to inform me of the exact day." He shot Mace a mild glare, but Mace only waved a dismissive hand. "I trust the journey wasn't too taxing?" Jon exchanged glances with Margaery. "The roads were fair enough. We had a few slow passages in the neck, but otherwise it was uneventful." "Good," Loras said, taking a seat. "I imagine you'll find Highgarden quite different from Winterfell. Let me know if you wish to train with any of our knights. Perhaps a friendly spar." Jon inclined his head. "I'd like that, thank you." Margaery watched the exchange with relief. Loras was an important figure in the Tyrell household, respected for his prowess, idolized by many, and a close confidant to Margaery. If he and Jon could grow to trust each other, it would ease many potential strains in the alliance. She sipped her wine and changed the conversation, inquiring about how the orchard fared this year, whether the apple blossoms had begun. They passed the meal in a mixture of light banter and subtle politics. Olenna asked pointed questions about King Robert's state. Is he half-crippled now, or was it merely a flesh wound from that boar? And about the Lannisters' influence in the north. Margaery parried these queries with careful answers, deferring to Jon when needed. Jon, still adjusting to the pace of Tyrell conversation, did his best to respond without revealing anything that might cause friction. All the while, Mace Tyrell gloated about the upcoming tournaments in the Reach, and Loras listened with a half-smile. By the time they retired for the night, Jon felt both exhausted and strangely invigorated. In his chamber with Margaery, he confessed, "Your grandmother is formidable." Margaery laughed, beginning to remove her jewelry. "That's a kind way to put it. She's more than formidable. She's cunning, unafraid to say exactly what she thinks. Be prepared for more of her pointed remarks." Jon sighed. "I'll keep my guard up. But I suppose it's refreshing that she's direct rather than hiding everything behind pleasantries." She does that too in her own way," Margaery said wryly, hanging up a delicate necklace. "But in the end, if she sees value in us, our marriage, she'll support it." Jon crossed to the window, looking out at the moonlit gardens. Lanterns glowed in the orchard below, illuminating winding paths and neat rows of trimmed hedges. It was a world away from the rugged, shadowy godswood of Winterfell. "I hope we can prove that value," he murmured. "I don't want to be seen as some northern upstart who'll vanish when the snows call me back." Margaery came up behind him, slipping her arms around his waist. "You're not an upstart. You're a true partner in this alliance. Show them your worth, your honor, your dedication to House Stark. It will speak for itself." He placed a hand over hers, grateful. "I'll do my best." They lingered there, letting the warm night breeze brush over them. Far below, they heard distant laughter from the guards or stable hands, the hum of life in a castle that rarely slept. Margaery eventually led him away from the window, reminding him that tomorrow would bring its own challenges, from greeting lesser lords to meeting with her father about the trade negotiations. Jon followed her with a calm acceptance. If this was their path, he would walk it with unwavering resolve. In the days that followed, Highgarden revealed its facets like a flower unfolding in sunlight. Margaery guided Jon through the winding gardens, pointing out rare blooms that thrived in the mild climate of the Reach, golden roses that matched the Tyrell sigil, vibrant reds and pinks, exotic blossoms brought from Essos by traveling merchants. Well-tended fountains sparkled in the courtyards, and peacocks strutted across clipped lawns. Servants bustled about in cheerful efficiency, while visiting knights strolled in pairs, discussing the next tournament or the local gossip. Jon marveled at the scale of it all. For him, gardens had always been a modest patch of Winterfell's courtyard where hardy northern herbs and vegetables grew. The only color in the north's cold months was the crimson leaves of the weirwood tree, or the subdued greens in the glass gardens. But here, in Highgarden, color was a constant tapestry. Even the castle's corridors were adorned with bright tapestries depicting flowering meadows, heroic battles under sunny skies, and legendary knights receiving garlands from ladies fair. Yet, beneath the aesthetic splendor, Jon sensed the subtle currents of ambition. The Tyrell knights and lords who lingered in the castle often cast appraising glances at him, some curious, some doubtful. He was Ned Stark's son in blood if not in name, and Margaery's husband, but many questioned how far that connection could elevate him in a southern hierarchy that prized lineage above all else. Jon could practically hear the silent question. Why wed the Rose of Highgarden to a bastard? Olenna Tyrell, true to her word, summoned Margaery and Jon to her solar. It was an airy room overlooking a portion of the gardens, with large windows thrown open to the breeze. Lady Olenna reclined in a cushioned chair, nibbling sweet biscuits as she surveyed them. A handful of attendants hovered near, but Olenna soon dismissed them with a wave of her gnarled hand. "Sit," she commanded, pointing her cane at two chairs. Margaery and Jon obeyed, exchanging wary glances. Olenna wasted no time. "I hear King Robert nearly got himself killed on your watch. A boar, was it?" Jon cleared his throat. "Yes, my lady. It was a grave injury, but he recovered enough to return to King's Landing." "Pity," Olenna muttered, biting into a biscuit. "The realm might be better off if that drunken oaf were replaced by someone with more sense. Not that I wish him actual death, mind you. Only a forced retirement, if you understand me." She shot Margaery a sharp look. "And what of the Queen? That golden-haired lioness must have eyed your marriage with suspicion." Margaery inclined her head. "She was polite to our faces, though we felt her watching. She left after the king healed." Olenna snorted. "Polite to your faces, but scheming behind your backs. Typical Lannister. And you, Jon Snow, how did you find King Robert? Was he wary of you or too drunk?" Jon shifted. "He seemed mostly curious, my lady, though he did call me a bastard in front of the assembled lords. He gave his blessing to the marriage, but I can't say he seemed to like me." Olenna waved her cane dismissively. "He doesn't like anything that demands more of his empty treasury. The Tyrells, the Starks. He sees us as a means to keep the realm from crumbling under his debts. Well, at least you're forging alliances beyond the Lannisters' control. That might keep things in balance for a time." Margaery spoke carefully. "Grandmother, we do wish to see the realm stable. House Tyrell's resources could benefit the North, just as the North's produce, timber, furs, can benefit us." Yes, you speak that line well. Your father wants me to ask if you've gleaned any new advantage from the Starks for the Tyrell cause." Margaery's cheeks colored slightly. "We are not using Jon's family, grandmother. We want a genuine alliance, not a parasitic arrangement." Olenna arched an eyebrow. "Parasitic, is it? Perhaps not. But let us not be naive. There are always two sides to every trade. We give something, we get something. The question is, do you, dear granddaughter, intend to remain more loyal to your northern husband or to your father's southern ambitions?" Jon stiffened at the directness of the question, but Margaery lifted her chin. "I refuse to frame my loyalties as if they must oppose each other. I serve both House Stark and House Tyrell." Olenna's gaze lingered on Margaery, then flitted to Jon. A ghost of a smile curved her lips. "Good answer, child. Let us see if reality proves so accommodating. In any case, you have my blessing for what it's worth. I find it amusing, if nothing else, that you too have broken the mold." She waved the biscuit in John's direction. You boy, continue to hold your head high. We might not love your lack of a proper name, but if you prove capable, you'll find admirers enough in this castle. Especially if you can best a few of our knights in a friendly match. She eyed his physique. You do look sturdy. I appreciate the advice, my lady, John said, uncertain whether to feel relieved or uneasy. Olenna leaned back. Off with you now. I grow tired, and my biscuits are nearly gone. Margaery, fetch me a new supply from the kitchens, will you? These ones are too bland. Margaery rose, curtsying as gracefully as she could. As you wish, grandmother. John followed suit, bowing before they withdrew. Outside, Margaery let out a breath, wearing a half-amused, half-exasperated look. That went as well as it could. She's being charitable in her way. John rubbed the back of his neck. She's certainly not shy, but I sense she's testing us. She wants to ensure we're not naive. Margaery nodded. My grandmother always tests. She sees the realm as a chessboard. Every move must be deliberate. She paused, gazing down a corridor lined with vases of fresh roses. Come, let's walk the eastern terrace. The feast for us is tomorrow night, and we'll need a plan to handle Father's showmanship. The promised feast arrived with all the flair Mace Tyrell could muster. Highgarden's great hall was bedecked with garlands of flowers, fresh roses, lilies, and other blossoms woven into intricate patterns that draped from columns and archways. Long tables groaned under the weight of roasted meats, fresh fish from the mander, salads bursting with color, sweet pastries shaped like roses, and an endless supply of arbor wine. Musicians played lively tunes, their notes dancing across the vaulted ceiling. Margaery wore a gown of pale green and gold, matching the Tyrell colors, while John donned a finely tailored doublet in deep gray with delicate green embroidery around the cuffs. A nod to both Stark and Tyrell. They entered arm in arm, greeted by polite applause from the assembled guests. Local lords, knights, and ladies who had come to see this new union in person. Ser Loras escorted them to the high table, where Mace Tyrell sat like a king at the feast, Olenna on his left, seats reserved for Margaery and John on his right. Mace raised a golden goblet as soon as they were seated. My friends, he boomed, we gather to honor my beloved daughter, Margaery, and her husband, Jon Snow, who unites the North and the Reach in bonds of friendship. May our houses flourish together. A cheer echoed through the hall. John stiffened slightly at the sudden attention, but he forced a confident smile. Margaery lifted her own goblet, acknowledging the toast, and the hall resumed its clamor. Servants poured wine, platters were passed, and the feast began in earnest. Minstrels sang songs of chivalry and romance, and a few bold jugglers performed with colored balls that matched the Tyrell sigil. Early in the feast, a stout man with a bristly mustache approached the high table, bowing deeply. Lord Tyrell, he said respectfully, I bring greetings from House Tarly. My Lord Randall regrets he cannot attend this evening, being called away on pressing business, but he wishes to convey his congratulations to your daughter and her husband. Mace beamed, though his eyes flicked to John. Excellent, excellent. We appreciate House Tarly's courtesy. Perhaps they'll join us for the tournament soon. The messenger bowed again, then turned to John, offering a smaller bow. Lord Snow, House Tarly extends its compliments. May the Seven bless this union. John, feeling slightly awkward, returned the bow. Thank you, he said. We respect House Tarly's martial prowess. We hope to see them soon. As the messenger departed, Olenna leaned over, tapping a finger to her chin. Interesting, she muttered. Randall Tarly is as proud as a peacock and rarely acknowledges alliances that don't directly bolster his standing. Your father must have coaxed him to send even that token greeting, Margaery. Margaery sipped her wine, non-committal. It's a start. Lord Tarly has always valued strength, so perhaps he sees some advantage here. Olenna's only response was a faint harumph before turning back to her meal. Below them, in the center of the hall, couples began to dance as the music shifted to a courtly tune. Mace prodded John and Margaery, urging them to take the floor and demonstrate the union of North and South. Margaery rose gracefully, extending a hand to Jon. He accepted it, nerves flaring. He was no expert dancer, but Margaery had patiently taught him the steps for a few southern dances. They descended to the open space, joined by other pairs. Margaery placed one hand on Jon's shoulder, guiding him with subtle pressures, and they began to move. The music's rhythm was lively yet elegant, and Margaery flowed through it with ease. Jon kept his focus on her, relying on the muscle memory of their practice. He stepped carefully, pivoting when needed, trying to ignore the hundreds of eyes upon them. To his relief, it went smoothly enough. Margaery's confidence lent him poise, and as they spun, he glimpsed genuine smiles among the watchers. A mix of curiosity, approval, and perhaps some envy. For a moment, the tension in his chest loosened, replaced by a sense of shared joy with the woman who had become his partner in more ways than one. When the dance ended, applause rippled through the hall. Jon and Margaery returned to the high table, where Mace Tyrell pumped Jon's hand. "Well done. You see, the North can learn our graceful ways after all." He laughed, though Jon wasn't sure if it was an attempt at kindness or condescension. Olenna merely inclined her head, though there was a faint twinkle in her eye. Over the course of the evening, more guests approached, offering congratulations and seeking introductions. Margaery remained poised, leading conversations, bridging the gap between Jon and these southern lords and ladies. Jon recognized a few from stories: House Caswell of Bitterbridge, House Florent of Brightwater Keep. Each meeting was a test of courtesy. Some were polite, a few openly warm, and others a touch condescending, their compliments thinly veiled interrogations about Jon's station. Jon's shoulders grew taut as the feast wore on, but Margaery's presence tempered his frustration. When a certain Lady Alice Beesbury chirped, "And do you find your new husband refined enough for your tastes, dear Margaery?" Margaery responded with a cool but gracious smile, proclaiming that Jon's honor and kindness outshone any superficial measure of refinement. Lady Alice retreated, suitably chastised. Jon's gratitude to Margaery deepened, mixed with admiration for how deftly she navigated these snipes. At last, the feast began to wind down. The music softened, the dancing slowed. Drowsy guests filtered out, or settled into quieter corners with cups of wine. Margaery excused herself, stepping aside to speak with a cluster of her lady friends. Olenna had also withdrawn, citing fatigue, leaving Mace Tyrell to doze in a large chair, a nearly empty goblet in hand. Jon sank onto a seat near the dais, letting out a long breath. The night had tested him at every turn, and he was worn. He felt a presence at his shoulder. Turning, he saw Ser Loras standing there, arms folded, a faint grin on his lips. "You survived," Loras remarked, eyeing the half-empty hall. "Congratulations." Jon chuckled wearily. "Barely." Loras seated himself beside Jon, calling for a servant to bring 2 cups of watered wine. "Feasts here can be intense. You handled yourself well. My sister's presence likely helped." Jon nodded, swirling the wine in his cup. "She's incredible. I'd be lost without her tonight." Loras studied him. "You genuinely care for her, don't you?" The direct question caught Jon off guard. He met Loras's gaze. "Yes, I do." For a moment, Loras said nothing. Then he inclined his head, as though coming to a decision. "I'm glad. She deserves a partner who sees more than her beauty or her family name. I confess, I wasn't sure what to expect from the bastard of Winterfell. But I see you're honest, at least, and you respect her." Jon's throat constricted slightly with unexpected emotion. "Thank you, Ser Loras. I mean that. I know how important you are to Margaery." Loras looked away, a trace of melancholy flickering across his face. "We lost our mother when we were young, and our elder brothers in infancy. It's always been Margaery and me, enduring father's puffery and grandmother's maneuvers. She's precious to me." Jon watched him carefully. "I understand. I have siblings I'd do anything to protect. Your sister means the world to me as well." Then perhaps we'll find ourselves on the same side in the days to come, Loras said quietly, sipping his wine. There are rumblings, beyond this feast. King Robert's fiasco only heightened tensions in King's Landing. The crown's debts are mountainous, and the Targaryen exiles across the sea. Some say they're forging alliances with Dothraki hordes. War might come again. We must be ready. Jon felt a chill run through him, despite the warm hall. Ned, my father, suspects as much, though he tries to maintain peace. The Lannisters, we can't trust them. And if a Targaryen truly returns to claim the throne, all the realm may be thrown into chaos. Loras nodded. Which is why House Tyrell forging bonds with House Stark could be crucial. My grandmother sees it. Father sees it too, though he might deny it. You and Margaery are our link to the north. When trouble comes, we might need your help just as much as you need ours. Jon considered that. If it's for the good of the realm, I'll do my part. But I'm no lord of Winterfell. My father and brother Robb hold greater sway. Perhaps, Loras said. But your marriage to Margaery ties you directly to Highgarden. The lords of the Reach will look to you if you prove yourself worthy. And if House Stark stands behind you, well, it could shift the balance of power. Jon set down his cup, grappling with the weight of those words. He remembered what Tyrion Lannister had said in Winterfell's library, that some might see him as a threat or a pawn. Now, Loras was suggesting a similar idea, that his position was far more pivotal than he ever intended. We'll see, Jon murmured. I never sought this power or this role. Loras smirked. Those who never sought power often handle it better than those who crave it. Just be mindful. Even in Highgarden's sweet air, plots can bloom like weeds. Jon found no answer to that, and the silence stretched until Margaery returned, noticing their subdued expressions. She laid a gentle hand on each of their shoulders. What grave matters have you two been discussing? She teased, though concern lit her eyes. Only the future, Loras said, rising from his seat, and how we might shape it. He bowed lightly. Sister, Jon, enjoy the rest of your evening. He slipped away, leaving them alone. Margaery watched him go, a shadow of worry on her face. He told you about the rumblings of war, didn't he? Jon nodded, resting a hand over hers. He did. Are you worried? She hesitated, then nodded. Yes, but not just about war. I worry about how quickly the realm would tear itself apart. When lords smell weakness in King's Landing, alliances can shatter. Our marriage might be tested. Jon's grip on her hand tightened. Then we stand firm. We can't solve everything, but we can keep our houses bound. She offered him a soft smile. Yes, let's go rest. This feast has drained me. They slipped away from the hall, weaving through the scattered revelers, servants cleaning up spilled wine, and a few drunken knights boasting about their next tourney. The corridor leading to their chambers was blessedly quiet. Outside, the night sky stretched clear and star-filled over Highgarden's towers. The scent of nocturnal blossoms wafted through open windows, a gentle reminder that the Reach's beauty still lingered even after the hall's fanfare faded. In the privacy of their chamber, they shed the trappings of the feast. Margaery gently set aside her ornate cloak, removing pins from her hair as she sank onto a cushioned seat. Jon watched her with a mix of tenderness and admiration. He thought of how she had steered him through the evening's trials, handled Lady Beesbury's veiled insult, curtsied to her father's pomp, and smiled at knights who might hold doubts about him. She had faced it all with unshakable poise. He stepped behind her, resting his hands on her shoulders. "Thank you," he murmured, voice low, "for everything tonight." She tilted her head back, eyes meeting his. "We're in this together, Jon Snow. It's as much your victory as mine." He bent to kiss her hair, exhaling a breath that carried the tension of the feast away. "I just hope we can keep winning. Sometimes I feel like I'm walking on a thin edge between two worlds." "We both are," she said softly, reaching up to squeeze his hand. "But I'd rather walk it with you than face it alone." He slipped around to face her, gently lifting her chin. Their gazes locked in the dim light of the chamber's candles. The rest of the world, with its intrigues and threats, receded for a moment. In that hush, they reminded themselves of what bound them together beyond politics, beyond names. A quiet trust, a bond forged in the snows of Winterfell and the perfumed gardens of Highgarden alike. He leaned in, and she met his kiss, soft and lingering. The day's exhaustion ebbed away, replaced by the warmth of closeness. They stayed like that for a time, each drawing strength from the other, until at last they doused the candles and slipped into bed. The night held no more feasts or dances, no prying eyes. Only two souls who had found a fragile unity amid the fractious tides of Westeros. In the days following the feast, the swirl of Highgarden's social life continued. Margaery and Jon spent mornings conferring with Mace Tyrell about trade proposals. The prospective deal was straightforward enough. The Reach would offer shipments of grain, fruit, and other produce to the north in exchange for furs, iron, and timber, particularly valuable for building new ships and reinforcing keeps. Jon, drawing on Ned's instructions, suggested a stable arrangement of caravans that would run seasonally, taking advantage of the less perilous road conditions in the warmer months. Mace was enthusiastic, though he kept hinting about possible expansions or new markets, especially if the crown floundered under debt. Afternoons were often filled with tours or visits to the local villages, allowing the new couple to show themselves to the small folk. Margaery insisted on greeting them in a cordial, friendly manner, listening to any complaints or well wishes. Jon, though initially uneasy at so many southern faces turned his way, found that the small folk appreciated a stark presence. The North's reputation for harsh but fair governance seemed to precede him, and the mention of Ned Stark's name elicited cautious respect. Margaery's presence smoothed out any wariness, her southern grace bridging the gap. Slowly, the sense of novelty around the northern husband transformed into acceptance, at least in the outer ring of Highgarden's domain. During these outings, Ghost often trotted behind them, drawing gasps from villagers who had never seen a direwolf. Children shrank back at first, only to edge forward curiously when Ghost remained calm at Jon's side. Margaery sometimes knelt to stroke the wolf's thick fur, explaining that he was a loyal companion from the far north. A few brave souls ventured a touch, marveling at the powerful creature's presence in the land of roses. Evenings brought smaller dinners, sometimes with local lords, sometimes private moments in the gardens. Occasionally, they encountered Lady Olenna, who peppered them with questions about their progress on the trade agreements. She seemed generally satisfied that Mace was being less of a buffoon than usual, no doubt thanks to Margaery's careful coaxing. Amid this routine, Jon found an unexpected solace in training at Highgarden's practice yard. Ser Loras had arranged for a group of knights to spar with Jon, testing his skill in swordsmanship, archery, and even jousting. Jon was no accomplished juster. He'd had little practice with lances in the north, as the terrain and cost made such tournaments rarities. But Loras insisted, lending him a suitable horse and guiding him through the technique. Jon's first attempts were rough. His seat was strong, but his lance control wavered. More than once, Loras unhorsed him with a skillful strike, sending Jon tumbling into sand that had been laid down in the yard. Onlookers snickered or clapped politely, depending on their sympathy. Jon, battered but determined, kept rising to try again. Over a few days, he improved incrementally, enough to land a glancing blow on Loras's shield. The Knight of Flowers offered praise, though it was tempered by the knowledge that Jon had far to go. Sword combat, on the other hand, was where Jon felt more at home. Though the southern style emphasized elegance and flourish, Jon's training at Winterfell gave him a firm foundation in direct efficiency. In practice bouts, he managed to outmaneuver a few lesser knights, forging a small measure of respect. When word got around that the northern bastard could hold his own in the yard, the mocking chuckles lessened. One late afternoon, after a series of sweaty practice matches, Jon found himself alone in the yard with Loras, both leaning on practice swords, breathing heavily. The other knights had departed, leaving the two to cool down in the lengthening shadows. "You're improving," Loras said, wiping sweat from his brow. "You might not dazzle the crowds in a tournament, but you're solid in a fight." Jon managed a half grin. I'd rather be solid in a real fight than dazzle in a tourney. Loras chuckled, sheathing the practice blade. Fair enough, but you've proven yourself more than capable, Jon. Many here have taken note. My father might posture, but he's pleased to see you can handle yourself. Jon nodded, letting out a slow breath. Thank you, Sir Loras, for training with me, and for not going easy. Where's the fun in going easy? Loras asked with a smirk. Then his expression turned more serious. Listen, I'll be heading to Brightwater Keep soon for a short visit. House Florent is hosting a minor tourney. If war does come, we'll need to keep alliances with the lesser houses strong. Jon thought of the endless array of houses he'd met at the feast, each with its own pride and agenda. Let me guess, you'll be competing? Of course, Loras said, as though it were obvious. And winning if I can help it. He tapped Jon's shoulder with a friendly pat. In the meantime, you and Margaery should continue building goodwill here at Highgarden. If you need anything, resources, introductions, just let me know before I go. Jon appreciated the offer. I will. Safe travels to you when you depart. They parted ways. Jon lingered a few moments, gazing at the practice yard. The sun's gold light slanted across the dusty ground, catching the edges of a row of training swords racked on a wooden frame. Somewhere beyond the castle walls, a singer's voice rose in a distant ballad, telling some story of old knights and star-crossed lovers. He closed his eyes, feeling the weight of the southern air on his skin. The world was shifting, both within Highgarden and beyond it. He could sense the tension like a barely audible hum, even amid the castle's superficial cheer. He turned and headed inside, seeking Margaery's company. She had once told him that even if everything else felt strange, they would stand together. It was a thought he clung to as he navigated these foreign halls. The next significant test came not from a southern house, but from a raven carrying news from the north. It arrived on a hazy morning, the sky veiled in clouds that threatened summer rain. The bird bore the stark sigil, and the letter was addressed to Jon and Margaery jointly, with Ned's neat, unadorned handwriting. Jon read it in Margaery's chambers, his brow furrowing. She hovered anxiously, noticing his sudden tension. "What does it say?" she asked. Jon cleared his throat. "Father says there's been an increase in wildling raids near the wall. The Night's Watch is requesting more men, and there are unsettling rumors of strange creatures, sightings in the far north. Most of the Watch dismiss them as tall tales, but Father wants to stay vigilant." He exhaled slowly. He also mentions that tensions in King's Landing have flared again. Lord Tywin Lannister is pressuring the crown for debts, and King Robert's mood is increasingly erratic. Margaery pressed her lips together. "How bad is it?" "Bad enough that Father suggests we remain in Highgarden until further notice," Jon said, scanning the next lines. "He's not summoning us back. He says the roads near Moat Cailin and the Neck might soon be dangerous, if bandits realize the realm is in turmoil. He also thinks we can do more good here, forging stronger ties with the Reach." She nodded, thoughtful. "Your father is wise. He senses that if the realm collapses into war or chaos, we'll need all the allies we can get. And from the sounds of it, the crown is on shaky ground." Jon set the letter aside. A part of him had hoped to return to the north soon, to see Winterfell and reassure himself that all was well. But Ned's message made it clear that the best move was to remain in the south, prepared for any shift in the political winds. "I wonder if I should send some men to the wall, offer any help we can." Margaery's eyes searched his. "That's a noble thought, but we can't dispatch men from the Reach to the wall without your father's direct arrangement. It might look suspicious, Tyrell men in the north or even a coalition from our retinue. Besides, the Night's Watch might not welcome unfamiliar southern knights." Jon looked away, frustration gnawing at him. He recalled the vow he nearly took to serve the Watch, how that path had once defined his destiny. Now, faced with their growing plight, he felt powerless to assist from so far away. "I know," he admitted, "but it feels wrong to stand idle if the Watch is in trouble." Margaery moved closer, resting a reassuring hand on his arm. We can help the Watch indirectly. Perhaps your father can negotiate with the Tyrells for supplies, grain or coin for recruits. The North alone can't staff the Watch enough if the problem is truly dire. Jon grimaced. That's a good idea. My father might have already considered it. I'll send him a response, suggesting that the Tyrells might be open to contributing to the Watch's cause in exchange for trade privileges. Father would handle the details. She nodded, proud of his pragmatic turn of mind. Let's do that. Meanwhile, we'll keep an ear to the ground for any news from King's Landing. If Robert truly loses his grip, the realm could fracture. Your father's instincts are to keep us here to help gather strength. He inhaled, steadying himself. Yes, I'll see to it right away. They crafted a careful response. Margaery's scribe penned the words in clear script under Jon's guidance, expressing concern for the wildling raids, offering to coordinate a potential arrangement of supplies or volunteers if House Tyrell was amenable, reaffirming their readiness to remain in Highgarden, forging alliances and standing for the realm's peace. Once the letter was sealed with the wolf's head for Ned and the Tyrell rose pressed in wax, they handed it to the Raven Keeper, who promised to send it north immediately. After the Raven took flight, Margaery turned to Jon. It's unsettling, she said, echoing his earlier worry. The realm feels like a tinderbox. Jon thought of the swirling rumors. Targaryens across the sea, Lannisters pressing for power, a possibly unstable king, and the creeping darkness beyond the wall. He recalled the words of House Stark. Winter is coming. They had always seemed more than a literal season. They were a warning of gathering storms, of perils that came from the edges of night. Then we must be the steady flame in the dark, he said quietly, meeting her gaze. For our families, for the North, and for the Reach. She nodded, determination lighting her eyes. We will. The summons came from Mace Tyrell a week later. He requested Jon and Margaery join him in the Solar, along with several prominent bannermen from lesser houses around Highgarden. The message was brief, but the tone was clear. Negotiations. Jon and Margaery arrived to find Mace already seated in a large chair, a table spread with maps and scrolls. Two bannermen stood to one side, Lord Mullendor, a thin man with a sharp nose, and Ser Colin Fossaway, a robust knight with auburn hair. Olenna Tyrell was present too, perched in a corner chair, tapping her cane on the floor impatiently. Mace beckoned them forward. Ah, there you are. Come, come. We've had some intriguing news from the crown. Apparently, they're short of coin again. He let out a theatrical sigh. And they want to increase taxes on certain lords to make up the difference. Ridiculous, of course, and we, as good subjects, must politely refuse or renegotiate. Margaery took a seat, Jon beside her. The crown is taxing the Reach more heavily? So it seems, Mace said, drumming his fingers on the table. Specifically, they're targeting the wine and grain exports, an easy way to line the royal coffers. But it's an affront to us, especially when we already feed half of Westeros. Lord Mullendor spoke up, his voice reedy. We believe it's the Lannisters' doing, applying pressure to make the Tyrells pay more, likely to settle the crown's debts to Lord Tywin. A cunning move, if a blatant one. Olenna sniffed. Cunning, yes, but we can outmaneuver them if we have the right alliances. We have the North now. Perhaps we can open alternate trade routes that bypass the crown's oversight. Less profit for the Lannisters, more for us. Mace nodded vigorously. Exactly. If the Starks are willing to formalize new trade deals that funnel goods through White Harbor or Eastwatch, we could avoid some of the tolls the crown imposes near the capital or the sea routes around King's Landing. Jon leaned forward, a flicker of understanding crossing his face. So you're suggesting we ship goods directly between Highgarden and northern ports, circumventing the crown's heavier taxes? Yes, Olenna said curtly. Though we must do it carefully. The crown might cry treason if it notices a dramatic drop in taxable shipments. But if we label it as a local exchange for the North's benefit, grain for timber, wine for iron, then we can claim it's essential for both regions. Margaery considered the ramifications. This would strengthen the bond between the North and the Reach, but it might anger the king, or the Lannisters, if they realize we're circumventing the official tax routes." Mace shrugged theatrically. Robert's never had much head for details, as long as he has enough coin for his hunts and feasts. And Cersei might sniff around, but we can pay lip service to compliance, just not so much that we impoverish ourselves. Jon frowned. My father would want to avoid a direct conflict with the crown. He's loyal to King Robert. We must ensure we're not openly defying royal law. Perhaps there's a middle ground. Some shipments go through official channels, while others remain local. Olenna gave an approving nod. Prudent. We need the Stark's official stance before we commit. Write to your father, explain the situation, and gauge how far we can push. If he's on board, we proceed. If not, we find another strategy. Lord Mullendore and Ser Fossaway exchanged glances. Fossaway spoke up. The lesser houses will follow House Tyrell's lead, but we do want assurances that if the crown retaliates, we won't stand alone. Jon felt the weight of their collective gaze. He chose his words carefully. House Stark has no intention of leaving the Reach defenseless if the crown acts unjustly. But I cannot speak for all the North. My father must decide how we proceed. Mace Tyrell looked satisfied, as though expecting no less. Good. Then let us craft a letter that expresses our mutual desire for a fair trade arrangement that doesn't cripple us with taxes. Olenna, will you see to it that we phrase it so we don't sound like we're threatening open rebellion? He laughed, though the undertone hinted at real caution. Olenna rolled her eyes but nodded. I'll ensure it's readable. I can't promise you won't sound like a pompous windbag, Mace. The meeting ended with general agreement. Jon and Margaery left the Solar with a sense of the precarious line they were walking. On the one hand, forging direct trade routes would strengthen the Northreach alliance and allow them to circumvent the Lannisters' grasp. On the other, it could provoke the crown if done too openly. Margaery squeezed Jon's hand as they walked down the corridor. Sooner or later, she said softly, this tension with the crown might erupt. Are we ready? Jon let out a breath. We must be. The alternative is to let the Lannisters dictate everything. My father won't let that happen, and neither, it seems, will your grandmother. They exchanged a small, wry smile. Together they would navigate the labyrinth of politics, even if each step threatened to set off new conflicts across the Seven Kingdoms. Time slipped by in a swirl of negotiations and garden walks, dancing lessons and letters home. Highgarden's routine became familiar to Jon. The sunrise gilding the castle's white stone, the midday bustle of courtiers, the lively dinners with Mace's endless chatter. He came to know certain lords, like Ser Rowan, a quiet but honorable man, and certain ladies, like Lady Meredith Crane, who admired Ghost from a distance. Each connection was a small thread, weaving him deeper into the fabric of the Reach. But for every bond formed, he felt a faint tug of longing for the North. As the days grew warmer, he wondered how Summerfell looked in the newly thawed season, how Robb fared training new recruits, how Arya and Sansa passed their days. Margaery sensed his mood, occasionally drawing him aside to remind him that they would return, when the time was right. One late afternoon, as they strolled the orchard paths, Margaery suddenly paused. A faint rustling in the branches overhead caught her attention. She stepped closer, drawing aside a bough of blossoms to reveal a tiny bird's nest. Inside, 3 small eggs nestled, pale and speckled. Margaery's face lit with gentle delight. Look, she whispered to Jon, pointing. He leaned in, smiling at the fragile beauty. Spring in the Reach, he murmured. Seems so different from the North's new season. There, the snow only just melts, and everything is soaked with cold water. She nodded, carefully releasing the branch. Here, life bursts forth in color, even in small things like a bird's nest. Turning, she gazed at him in the hush of the orchard. Thank you for adapting so well, Jon. I know this must sometimes feel alien. He touched her cheek lightly. It's not so alien now, with you beside me. Sometimes it's overwhelming, but I'm learning. They continued their walk, the orchard's heady scent enveloping them. As they rounded a bend, they spotted a figure standing near a flowering pear tree. Lady Olenna, leaning on her cane, apparently lost in thought. She glanced up at their approach, the sunlight framing her in an almost ethereal glow. It struck Jon as unusual that Olenna would be alone. She normally had an attendant or two. "Young ones," Olenna greeted curtly. "Enjoying the orchard?" Margaery inclined her head. "We are, grandmother. The blossoms are particularly lovely this year." Olenna waved her cane. "Yes, yes, as they always are in Highgarden. Though men would squander all this beauty in war if they had the chance." She paused, considering them both. "I came here to think about the future, ironically. Not much time left for me, so I must plan carefully." Margaery stepped closer, concern on her face. "Don't speak like that, grandmother." "Ha! I'll speak as I please," Olenna retorted, though not unkindly. "Time is precious, child. Now, I have a suspicion that events in the realm are moving faster than we realize. I've had letters from old friends at court. They say the king grows more unpredictable, and the Lannisters are tightening their grip. There are rumors, unpleasant rumors, about the legitimacy of the royal children. If that scandal comes to a head, the entire monarchy might collapse." Jon's heart thudded. "Are you certain?" Olenna shrugged. "As certain as one can be in the Game of Thrones. But I trust my sources more than I trust the official word from King's Landing. If war breaks out, if Robert Baratheon falls or is toppled, the Tyrells must decide where they stand. Will we back the Lannisters? Unlikely. Will we try to seat Renly Baratheon or Stannis? Possibly. Will a Targaryen land with an army? Gods know." Margaery's expression turned grim. "And what do you want us to do, grandmother?" Olenna eyed them both. "Keep your ears open. Build alliances quietly with those who share our interests. If there's to be a war, I'd rather see it avoided. But men are fools. They fight over crowns as crows fight over corpses. Highgarden must not be caught off guard." She shifted her cane, gazing at Jon. "You young man, have a role too. The North respects you, and you have a bond with the Starks. If the day comes when lords declare for one claimant or another, we may ask you to help sway the North in our favor." Jon's mouth went dry. "My father would decide for the North, not me." "He might, if he's still alive to do so. War is unpredictable. We must be ready for all contingencies." Olenna's voice softened. "I like you, Jon Snow. You have a good heart. But hearts can be tested severely. Don't let misguided loyalties ruin what you and my granddaughter have built." Margaery slipped her hand into Jon's, a quiet show of unity. "We'll remember, grandmother." Olenna nodded, satisfied for now. "Good. Now leave me to my orchard. I'm old enough to enjoy a bit of solitude among the trees without hearing more chatter about the damned monarchy." Margaery smiled a little, drawing Jon away. They continued along the path in a thoughtful silence until they reached a low stone bench near a small fountain. Seated there, they let the warm breeze brush over them, the gentle trickle of water soothing. Both felt the weight of Olenna's words. "She's right," Margaery said quietly. "War could come from many angles. King Robert's children. If that rumor about their parentage spreads, it'd be an explosion." Jon thought of the bleak possibility. "And if it does, the realm will be torn. My father would likely try to maintain order, but he's only one man, even if he has the entire North behind him." She nodded. "And the Tyrells would pick a side. Grandmother and father would never let the Lannisters gain full control if they can help it." Jon squeezed her hand. "Then we stand at the center of it all, bridging the North and the Reach. Whatever side we choose, we must choose it wisely and together." Margaery leaned her head on his shoulder, her voice low. "We will, no matter what storms come." They stayed that way, two figures in the orchard's calm, while across the realm, powers moved unseen. Cersei Lannister and her secrets, Robert Baratheon and his failing strength, the Targaryens across the narrow sea, the stirrings beyond the wall. All of them loomed like gathering clouds on the horizon. But in that moment, in the serenity of Highgarden's blossoming orchard, Jon Snow and Margaery Tyrell found a measure of peace and a quiet promise that they would face whatever came, hand in hand.